Hello and welcome to Supplement 4 of Super Deep Movie Analysis. I'm actor and screenwriter and overall filmmaker Lec Zorn, and returning after an exclusive 3 year tour of Europe, Scandinavia, and the subcontinent, Michelle Gussow, who's of course been with us for many episodes in the past and now rejoining us again. And this is a special edition of Super Deep Movie Analysis in which we're unlike all our past episodes and supplements, we're not going to discuss one or two particular films or trailers or shorts, but we're actually going to discuss um, independent filmmaking in general, which is something that, Michelle and I know a lot about firsthand, and that's something that's actually becoming a lot more popular here these days. Um, when I was a kid, I'm 48 now to put it in a historical perspective. And when I was a kid, just making an independent film would have been very hard. Certainly at that time, we could have never imagined making a movie on our phones. But that's the reality that we live in today. And then even if we could have made a film, then if we had like a rich parents who would fund it, then getting it in front of people would have been a very tall order. And even then, today with all the options available, that's not a challenge either. So basically, now we have a lot of people that are able to make independent films easily and cheaply, and get them in front of people easily and cheaply. And so we're hoping that this episode will do several things, hoping that it will be a guide for anybody who's interested in independent film, in being a part of them, and also that if you are in if you are working in independent film, we hope we'll give you some insights, some ideas that you can follow based on our experiences, and of course we'd love to hear yours as well. So feel free to give us your thoughts. And finally, we also hope that if you're a movie fan, which you probably are, that this episode will encourage you to delve into the very enriching world of independent film, because there's a lot of great material out there worth watching apart from the major Hollywood studios. So, anyway, Michelle, of course, it's appropriate to have you here because you're the one. I won't say you introduced me to independent film, but you certainly got me to be a part of the scene.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think you had expressed your interest in film in general, and
Yes.
you had noticed someplace that I said I was doing film. Is
Uh,
that what had happened?
no, what happened? Well, first of all, it goes back a couple of years earlier. My brother Robert McAtee has been a Hollywood actor for 20 years now. Finally got in the union a couple of years ago, and he has been in a few big productions. He's had speaking roles on both CSI Miami and Two Broke Girls, and he's had non-speaking roles in several episodes of Days of Our Lives, which appropriately was a soap opera that my maternal grandmother watched religiously during her life, and she would have been very proud of my brother for being on it. In fact, in one particular episode, my brother at a wedding sat immediately behind the character of Alice Horton, played by the late Frances Reed, in one of the very last episodes that she appeared in. She was the last original on the show. She appeared from the show's beginning in 1965 up until like 2007 or 2008.
Your grandmother would have been beside herself over that,
Yes,
absolutely.
yes. But most of the stuff he's done has been indie. And back, there were two things happened in late summer, early autumn of 2005. Um, I was over at the public library, one of the public libraries here in Indianapolis, in the foreign DVD section, and I was only there because my wife Sharita, Sherry, who's of Indian descent, was she would regularly borrow Indian or Bollywood movies to watch, which I hated. I think that they thought they were just so bad for the most part. Um, but basically, I would go over there just out of curiosity to check the foreign DVD section, and I'd say two-thirds of them were Indian. For those of you who don't know, India has a huge film industry. But I saw this film from Iceland, and it's like that's odd, Iceland of all places, this little isolated place of 300,000 people. So I thought this has got to be interesting. So I just got it out of curiosity. It was a movie called Noi, which is actually the subject of one of my earlier Super Deep movie analysis episodes. And I really was blown away by the movie. Obviously, it was made with very low resources, but it was acted and filmed and written brilliantly, and I recommend the film. 14 years later, still recommend it highly. And then shortly after that, my brother and his then girlfriend, Molly Leland, um, sent me a screenplay they had written called Trail of Crumbs, which a movie that was finally released in 2008, um, and which would have been my first on-screen role, except my scene got cut. But anyway, it was the first time I'd ever read a screenplay um, without having seen the movie, and I was really impressed by it. And I thought, okay, I want to do this. So the combination of Noi and seeing Noi and reading this Trail of Crumbs screenplay really set me into motion. I started, writing some stuff, and then I ran into Michelle a couple of years later at a coffee house called the Bean Cup, which was only open from 2006 to 2009 on the south side here in Indianapolis. And I had known her casually for about 10 years, but and I'd heard she was in film, and she, talked to me about it, and that led to us, talking a lot more. And then she got me involved in her later production, Soldier Song, which was filmed in 2009, released in 2011. So yeah, that's the unedited version of how it happened.
Yeah, what's interesting is because my involvement goes back, I was 12 years old.
Mm.
And I'm going to put it in historical perspective too. I'm 55 years old. And when I was 12, often it was still the time when if you said independent film,
Mm-hmm.
you meant porn.
Yeah.
I mean, now, and I can't really speak for other areas, but we are talking Indiana, Midwest, where that was sort of it. If you said you did independent film, people thought that was,
and
it was polite terminology for porn.
Well, and it's ironic you said that because, a few years ago, I discovered Antenna TV. I don't know if you're familiar with that
Yes.
station or not.
Oh, I love.
And they seem to have a deal at the time. They must have had a deal with Norman Lear where they had every one of his sitcoms from the set. For those of you who don't know, Norman Lear produced about every big sitcom in the 70s and into the early 80s. I think he's still living. He's like way up in his 90s. But anyway, one of them was Sanford and Son, and one of the storylines in one of the episodes is that Lamont Sanford, the son on the show, he had seen an ad about independent films, and it turned out it was a porno.
Yeah, so, well, I was going to say it's nice that kind of crossed over and went in the, Los Angeles area. But here, if I'm going to say independent at the time, it was more of a student film involvement.
Yeah.
And even then, you didn't have the student film, departments that you do now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you've been in a lot of student films. I've helped out with many.
Dozens.
And what the students are allowed to do now with those films by entering them into film festivals and owning the film for that matter.
And even just as something, putting it on YouTube or Vimeo, so that anybody in the world can see it, and it's a showcase. You can say, look, I like this job, and here's a sample of my work.
Because back when I was 12, when I did student films for a particular film class, one actually could have called the film class Make Better Home Movies 101.
Yeah.
And been more on the money. But I did a handful of these things. So they weren't porn, but they were bad. They were bad.
Oh, yeah.
And somebody actually online said, boy, I really would have liked to have seen the student films you were in. And I was like, so would I, because I actually didn't get to see them. Because what would happen, you'd make the film, get it all edited, turn it in like you would any other project, and the teacher would watch it and give you a grade, and you didn't even get the film back. So it wasn't even shown to the class often, as far as I was aware. So just the fact that student film is now a part of independent film as far, as just being this little one-off class.
Mm-hmm.
It is very different than when I was doing this and starting out with it. So I could probably yammer even longer, as we say in our super deep discussions. But the very first film I did was called Two Men Two, and that is two, the number two, men two also. And to kind of demonstrate how the class worked, as they explained it to me when we were on the set, is the teacher gave some kind of odd assignment with all kinds of things, and in fact, Two Men Two was the assigned title. So if you selected that particular title to do, you had like 4 people in the class who all turned in a film called Two Men Two, and how they interpreted it. And I actually have to admit, I looked back mentally at this recently and realized maybe that particular film, but I have no idea, I do have to say, if it actually came out looking like what I was familiar with. The plot had the potential to be pretty good. And I'll throw it out there, somebody can do it. It was actually took place on one floor of an apartment building, where you had a new tenant move in, and she's on the phone like every day with her friend Felicia. I don't know why I remember that, giving her accounts of what happened with the other tenants. And then what you'd see is what actually happened. So you were getting, like I always say, the Gladys Kravitz version of something, and then you get to see what really happened. And so that actually had the potential to be a good subject matter, I think.
Yeah, and who knows? Maybe one of our projects together, we could like try to
explore that.
Yeah,
hopefully wherever this home movie maker, he'd say, "Wait a minute, that was mine back in 1976."
Yeah, if you maybe could find him on Facebook, and get his permission. But
yeah, I don't remember the guy's name. I could tell you. I mean, I really don't. I don't know if if he was listening, would recognize it. By the way, wondering with the 12-year-old, just so you know, my very first role, I played the daughter of a hooker.
Oh, I didn't even know that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's my introduction to short films actually happened on Showtime back in the 80s. Like basically Showtime. I got Showtime in 1981. I was living in Madison, Indiana, my hometown, and back at that time, channels such as Showtime, the movie channel, HBO, were very big. They were great, especially if you lived in a small town and had few cinema options,
Yeah.
Because prior to that, once a movie left the theaters, you would probably never see it again. You might catch it on regular TV, but it would be in an edited for TV version, edited for time or content, and so it was a great opportunity to see movies that you otherwise wouldn't see, sometimes for the first time. And then there were plenty of movies that I'd never heard of before seeing on Showtime. But, basically, let's say like a movie was an hour and 40 minutes, because they would only start things like either at the top of the hour or like half past the hour. So sometimes if there'd be like 15 minutes from the end of one film to the next time slot, they would fill it in with things such as short films. And I really enjoyed some of the shorts I saw back then, and I've been looking for some of them online in recent years. Haven't found any of them.
Yeah. Now you find that most of those shorts then were independent.
Yeah, I'm sure they were. Yeah, and I would love to see those again. A lot of them I don't remember the title of. I just remember what happened. But now short films have become much more of an art. I mean, a lot of people take them a lot more seriously and have better resources. And I think one great thing about it, now that I've been working in film for 10 years now, in fact, this is the 28th, so yeah, it'll be in just 16 days from now, it'll be the 10th anniversary of my first speaking role in a film, which was in Michelle's Soldier Song. So, and I've acted in more than 200 films now, and mostly on set, but I've probably a couple of dozen now. I've done, I've voiced cartoons as well, and one thing that I've noticed and keep in mind, while I've done voiceovers literally for people all over the world, as far as my in-person acting, it's been in 5 states: Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, Illinois, and Missouri. So I haven't traveled that much out of the area. And one thing I've noticed in 10 years is that because there are so many more films being made here in this 10-year period, um, there are a lot more people going into acting, and the quality of the acting. I mean, it's a lot. I think it's probably a lot easier now. Um, and Michelle, of course, I don't know how you would feel if you cast a film today, but I think you'd probably find that it's a lot easier to find good quality actors here in Indiana now than it was 10 years ago.
Well, the interesting thing was that 10 years ago,
Hmm.
I had I actually targeted certain actors because remember we had done uh, a version of Soldier's Song prior,
Yes.
and there were certain actors I tried to target again, and they weren't available.
Hmm.
Or actually, something you'll find out too, they quit acting in that short period of time
Yeah.
because the expectation. Well, maybe we can talk about that sometime about what the expectation is when you
Yeah.
get into acting of any kind as to what making it is and how quickly you expect to do that. Um, but yeah, well, one of our actors though, came all the way from California, and he used to live here.
Hmm.
That was Scott Gagnon, who played Rick in Soldier's Song. But Tom Sparks, who played Greg, yeah, he was already here. We knew him. He'd been in the
Hmm.
original as a different character. Um, but I would guess that at this point there would be more people responding to a particular casting notice than I got.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm sure there would be, and I mean, I remember when I was first acting 10 years ago. You know, I Facebook was just starting to really become a big mainstream thing. At the time I
Yeah.
started acting, but I was doing most of my. I was searching for casting primarily on Craigslist, and I mean that sincerely. I mean, at the time, there were a fair number of real film jobs posted on
Right.
Facebook.
We're
Uh,
back to though with Craigslist. That's another one where a lot of the porn people were advertising for
yeah, yeah. So,
actors,
and it's but
but they would advertise as local independent film, and you had to be very very careful.
yeah, and so I got to the point pretty quickly that I was able to pick apart the real opportunities from the scams very quickly. Um, I always one of my biggest slogans is a little discernment goes a long way. Um, I apply that to film all the time. As far as people not falling
Now,
for
do you
scams.
find when you're auditioning, because I know you do a lot more auditioning, um, that you are auditioning against more people than you did 10 years ago for a particular role?
The thing is, I'm not the best person to ask that because the majority of the time when I do an audition, it's online.
Oh,
Yeah, I just do it in front of the webcam and send it in. Occasionally, I'll do it in person. Not a lot. In fact, I've noticed a lot fewer films now are doing in-person auditions anymore. I think, you know, um, 10 years ago when I started off, there weren't a lot of people that had webcams, or could even
okay,
like
yeah.
do it selfie style with a phone. So and I think that's one thing that has changed a lot. I see a lot fewer people. In fact, there are still some people who will say, you know, uh, the audition's on this date, but you can send in your audition through video. And now there's plenty that don't even have an in person audition.
Now, see, I still actually prefer that
Hmm.
because
I do too. Yeah.
and because when I am casting,
Yeah.
just from my perspective,
Yeah.
I may get somebody in front of me that because they're nervous or just
Hmm.
something, I know that they can give me what I want
Hmm.
and they're not really doing it. And if they just send in the video,
Hmm.
then I don't have the chance to give feedback at the moment and say, try it this way
Yeah.
or do that. And I really, for me, that's just how I like to do it, have
Hmm.
that one on one
Well,
with the actor.
yeah, and and then of course another option, a middle ground is if you can meet the person live on Skype. If you can't arrange a time to meet in person, where you can at least talk one on one. I
Right.
prefer to do it one on one because, and now that I've recently started directing shorts, and I plan to eventually direct features. I'm trying to warm up right now, and polish off my rough edges as a director, but the reason I would prefer doing it, live, whether it's in person or on Skype, is because what I want to see is how does the actor respond to direction.
And that absolutely.
Yeah,
And and like I said, sometimes I'm trying to elicit a feeling out
yeah,
of somebody. We were talking about with Soldier's Song, both with that and the previous attempt, the hardest role to cast was the younger brother Dan.
yeah,
Finding an actor when you'd send the sides, and it was a smaller role, I think, in their
yeah,
opinions. But when they saw what it entailed, they didn't want to go through with the audition.
yeah,
It was actually very difficult to find someone. But the way I met with this actor, and I was trying to elicit an emotion out of him rather than just read this script, you
yeah,
know. And I got him talking about something that was a very deep issue with him.
mhm,
And when he started doing it and was pulling that emotion, I said, "You've got it right there." I said, "If you can
yeah,
capture that
yeah, and of course,
in the character." And I guess, for me, independent film directing is a lot more than just worrying about step on the mark and say your line.
yeah, yeah,
I personally like to get a real feeling. I want people to watch the film
yeah.
or the project and believe that that person's experiencing that emotion.
Yeah, I do too, and it's interesting to hear stories about actors who've done certain things to provoke themselves. And what I always say, most of the time when you are, a vast majority of the time, when you're hired for a role, you've experienced the emotions that you're going to be asked to express on film. So you have to figure out how to bring those emotions to life. I mean, sometimes you can watch something that makes you laugh or cry or whatever, like a video that will have that effect on you, to do that right before you go on screen, to go in front of the camera. And if that'll work, and there's no right or wrong in this. Our emotions are very individual, so we have to figure out what works the best for us. And I've done that, watched things that got me in a certain mood right before I had to do a scene. Or one time I remember when I was because I'm afraid of heights, I was on top of, I was the movie Depersonalization, which is one of the most seen movies that I've ever been in. It's a 7-minute short. Just go into YouTube and type in Lec Zorn Depersonalization. It should be the first thing that comes up. Um, Basically, I was playing a guy who was like really, had who suffered from depersonalization disorder, and I had to look like really freaked out. And I had an idea, since I'm afraid of heights, I went over to the edge of the 6 or 7 story parking garage where we were filming, and I looked straight down, knowing that I would have a very bad reaction to it. And because of that, I probably looked more traumatized than I would have looked if I consciously tried to look traumatized. And so sometimes getting that best reaction means putting yourself in a very uncomfortable position. And if you're a director, which now I'm learning, sometimes it means, and sometimes people, sensitive people like me have a hard time doing this, but sometimes getting the performance you want out of your actor, results from you putting that actor in a very uncomfortable position, and there are a lot of ways that can be done. I mean, some directors are psychologically or verbally abusive to actors to get them to behave a certain way. And I've never done, I haven't done
Yeah.
that so far. I would be very uncomfortable doing it. Um, I mean, and sometimes things work that you don't think are going to work. I mean, I remember one of the first films I ever directed was recently. It was for the 60-second horror movie challenge. And because I don't envision myself being a horror director, I was reluctant about entering the contest, but I thought it would be a good challenge to make a movie that has to be exactly 1 minute,
Mm-hmm.
So, but I saw they had um, a comedy category. So I thought, okay, I can do a horror comedy,
Yeah.
nothing that involves gore or anything like that. So anyway, the idea is, I had I just basically did a parody of a haunted hotel movie, and I took this kid who had very little acting experience, 12-year-old kid, and anyway, the idea is that he has this vision about this room and about this particular room, and then he goes and starts opening in the door, and then I told him to look like he heard a demon voice, and I would imitate. I did it 6 or 7 times. I imitated the facial reaction I wanted, and he couldn't get it.
Right.
And then, and I was gonna dub in like an evil sounding monster voice. So then finally, on a whim, I just said in my best demon voice, I said, "Get out!" And then that's when he got it.
Mm-hmm.
And he finally got the facial reaction,
Right.
And so, and that was the take that we used. So, sometimes unintentionally things will work that you don't expect are going to work. But and there are stories, for example. I mean, the most infamous one probably is Stanley Kubrick, who was known as being very difficult to work with, and sometimes did literally hundreds of takes for his movies. And for contrast, Clint Eastwood supposedly normally doesn't do more than 3 takes of anything. Um, but Stanley Kubrick, was known for doing literally hundreds of takes. And during the making of The Shining, by all accounts, he was extremely verbally and psychologically abusive to Shelley Duvall, apparently to drive her into this, state of terror that someone who's living alone, with a crazy husband, for 6 months in a hotel. And I mean, if that was his goal, it worked, because if you look at her for about the last 2/3 of the movie, she looks completely miserable and disoriented and agitated, and like she's about to burst into tears at any moment. And so, and keep in mind that she was on the set of that movie for 13 months, um, and the movie took just under a year and a half to film. But and that, which is extremely abnormal. Most major studio movies are filmed in 2 or 3 months, and of course the kind of movies that Michelle and I make, the indies, sometimes they're filmed in a day, or in the case of Soldier Song, it was on 2 weekends.
It was two weekends.
Yeah.
And that's the thing with independent film. Often
Yeah.
you still have to work with other people's schedules and
Yeah.
their lives and their jobs, and it's always good to be able to to have it months in advance so people can arrange to be off work or whatever they have to arrange to do.
No, not necessarily months, but at least weeks.
Well,
and,
I mean, I found it with months.
Oh,
Because
maybe,
we
yeah,
had,
maybe
we
for
had,
you,
we
yeah.
Had, we had to coordinate a lot of people.
Granted, of course, you were bringing in somebody from California. That's something I've never done.
Yeah.
I've never brought. I mean, I remember the boy I was talking about from the horror short I did from Room 236. He came from Louisa, Kentucky, which is like 250
Yeah.
miles or something.
Yeah, I was going to
yeah,
say, now
yeah.
mind you, for a 60-second anything, I wouldn't bring anybody in from further than maybe that.
Yeah, and
But,
the only reason I brought him in for that is because he was already going to be coming up for another short at the time,
okay,
and I
yeah.
thought, well, we can film that the same day,
Right.
And I used that for his mother, since I said, I'll tell you what, you're coming in so far. If you bring up Zeb, I'll let him have the lead role in this other film, So she was glad to accept the
Probably
offer.
very happy to do that.
Yeah.
And I think it was just a very, very special circumstance that I had anybody coming from California.
Yeah, yeah.
And then and here's another like independent film situation. We actually had 2 people from California,
Yeah.
and
Oh, Nick.
yeah, Nick.
Yeah.
But Scott, who came to play the roommate in the hospital, he had been cast just a few weeks ahead because the original actor who had been cast forgot he'd been cast. I'm not even going to go into that, but that's something that can happen. I had stuff in my scent box going to him all along keeping him abreast. And seriously, what easily could have happened somehow is it could have ended up in his spam folder instead, and he wasn't getting
Yeah.
it. There's all kinds of things that could have happened, but he wasn't available. And so I remember I just said, "We have no more budget to bring you out," and he just said, because he was a SAG actor, and he said, "Do you mind doing the paperwork if he was willing to bring himself out." And I was like, "Okay." And it turned out he brought an awful lot to the film. And that's another thing I think with for me, why I like independent film is it can be anything you want it to be. It's independent.
Yeah.
And you don't have to follow a certain pattern or do it a certain way. I think you're completely free to make your vision happen.
Yeah, you are.
And that way I was able to listen. Didn't mean to jump
No,
over,
go ahead.
But no, that way I was able, if the actor actually said to me, are you the type, do you allow creative input from the actors? I said, if you run it by me first and I think it works. But that's the thing. I mean, it's not a protocol on a normal studio attached film set, possibly. But with independent, it gives you this broad, kind of broad spectrum where it can be anything.
Yeah, and the movie Death Race 2000, which I've never seen, but it's a cult classic. It's probably Sylvester Stallone's most famous pre-Rocky movie. But I picked up a DVD one time, and the guy who directed it, I don't remember his name, but he wrote a new essay on the back of it, and he said that making an independent film, making a not independent, he said making a low budget film gives you the freedom to take chances, which is true. And I think you look at how big the budget of most major studio movies are getting these days, now in the hundreds of millions. You don't have that freedom. I mean, if you're going to make a $200 million movie, which is not unusual these days for the major studios,
right,
the only way you're going to make your money back is by appealing to just about everybody on the streets. You have to go for the lowest common denominator, and even if there is some substance in the movie, you still have to do things to get the masses to do it. Like, let me give you an example. I took my kids to see Avengers Endgame, which it could be on the way to becoming the the highest grossing movie of all time. It did have the highest opening weekend of all time, more than $1 billion in its opening weekend worldwide. And it's a $346 million budget, which is third most of all time. And to put that in perspective, the original Superman, which came out in 1978, at the time it was the most expensive movie of all time, $55 million. So that shows you how out of control things are getting.
Right.
But the point is, there are some very, very good scenes. In fact, there were some excellent scenes in the movie. But my favorite scenes by far are those that had no action, no special effects, that just human, interaction and things like that. And like, for example, I haven't seen any of the earlier entries in the series, but apparently in the last movie before this one, there were a lot of people disappeared from the Earth, and there's this very moving scene where it shows in this town where it has like sort of a wall, like the one for the Vietnam Memorial, where it shows the names of all the people who disappeared, and you see people looking at the names of their loved ones. It's an incredibly moving scene. And if the entire movie was stuff like that, I would have really dug it. But there's just all this overblown special effects superhero stuff that I just can't get into.
It's interesting you're talking about the budgets, and that's another thing I find with independent film is the ability to get an awful lot of bang for one's buck.
Yeah, well, yes.
So to speak, to make a lot happen for a very little amount of money.
Yes,
and not saying that some independent films don't have larger budgets, but just for the most part, here we are, working with minimal resources and making something happen out of that.
Yeah, and of course the thing is, you have to remember. Now you look at why these films are so much more expensive. These Hollywood films. Some of it certainly you have better equipment that you're making it on. No question about that. But then a lot of it, that these people, the big stars, I'm trying to think who the big A-list stars are in Hollywood right now. But, Tom Cruise, I guess he's not the biggest A-list guy anymore. But I mean, the thing is, he's a guy because of his just, because of his name. I mean, when you pay like Tom Cruise or Kevin Costner or whoever the big stars are, um, what you're paying for, a lot of it is just the fame. That there are people who are going to go see the movie just because that person's
Right.
in it. It doesn't mean that person is a better actor than the next guy. I mean, those people obviously they are great actors, but there are other actors who are just as good who don't have the fame.
Right.
And
And that's the thing, I think independent film, you have the ability to find the diamonds in the rough too.
oh
And
yeah,
I think we've had some really good actors, some really
yeah,
solid performers.
yeah. We
And
have, and
and
I mean,
it just I've worked with some amazing people on
yeah.
independent, and you
So,
have.
so about yeah, and like you look at like for example, I go to a movie that I did a super deep movie analysis on all the way back in episode 2, Heaven Help Us. That was a major studio movie, but it basically you look at it. I mean, basically it was, as I said, it was Patrick Dempsey's first movie. It was Andrew McCarthy's, I think second or third. I think it was Kevin Dillon's second, Mary Stuart Masterson's third. And so they found a lot of diamonds in the rough, people who were
Hmm.
unknown and yet ended up becoming big stars,
Right.
especially Patrick Dempsey. And and I think that's why that movie has gotten more. It's become more famous after the fact because
Well,
of all
yeah.
the people who were the eventual stars that came out of the movie. Um, or another example, the original Footloose from 1984. The director of that movie, Herbert Ross, was famous for giving chances to unknowns. And you look at that movie. I mean, Kevin Bacon. He had been around for a few years, but he was not a star by any means, and he became a star with that movie. Diane Wiest, was a virtual unknown, went on to win 2 Oscars after that movie. John Lithgow, he was starting to become well known, but certainly his career blossomed after that movie. So Sarah Jessica Parker went on to become a big star, and she was just getting started at the time. So there are directors, even in Hollywood who will give who have an eye for talent, and who will give the unknowns a chance. And I think one thing that's great about us being here in the Midwest is that when we cast a film, we know that a certain person's presence. There's nobody who we can afford to hire whose presence is going to make a significant difference on the commercial fate of the movie. So we
Right.
just hire who we think is going to do the best job, who we're going to enjoy working with the most. And
Yeah.
and yeah, I love when I cast a film. I love going through all the auditions,
Hmm.
and picking out, and I try to give some kind of offer to everybody who auditions, just because I
I
appreciate
do.
that.
I do too. I
Yeah,
try to at least say I will find something on the set for you to do.
yeah,
And literally that's what happened even on Soldier's Song. You
yeah,
were driving.
yes,
I had brought
yes,
you onto the set to drive.
yeah,
We mentioned Nick before. It's Nick Capoletti. He did the music, all the music you hear in Soldier's Song,
yeah,
and he also played. We call him TG player, the guitar player that you see in the day room. And so I thought that Lec could pick him up at the airport and take him back to the airport because both being musicians,
I
you
didn't
would.
pick him up. I only
Well,
took him
and
there.
well, oh, that's right.
Yeah,
That was the only. Okay,
yeah,
so you had to take him back, but
yeah,
it was the idea, something that you could talk about, both being musicians. I figured that,
yeah,
and then, of course, what happened later is we brought we brought you back to play one of the soldiers, and then you had the speaking part
yes.
because 2 of our soldiers didn't even show up.
And that's, which is another example that
You
I
know,
use, and I think that because now I've been on both sides of the camera, I've been the actor and I've been the director. I know how it works both ways, and of course, it should be noted I've also acted in every film that I've directed, um, but but I think so many times people, they're big headed and they think they're too good for certain things. I mean, I remember one time I was in line to audition for a movie, and there's this guy in front of me, probably in his early 20s, and sometimes if you go to a casting call, um, there'll be like a sign up sheet, a sign in sheet, and sometimes there's even an attendant, and the attendant was asking everybody, if you do not get a role,
Right.
will you be an extra? And this guy said no, and then I took it. The older I get, the longer I get in film, the more I feel like I'm enough of an authority that I'm confident in telling people things. I'm to the point that I've gotten to the point the last couple of years where I will tactfully, of course, tell a director if I think something could be better, a certain way. And so far, by the way, it should be noted, I have never been rebuked by a director for that. And in most cases, you won't be. I mean, even
Yeah.
Stanley Kubrick, as hard as he was to work with, I mean, the whole thing for those of you who've seen The Shining, where Danny, he wiggles his finger like this and talks in that strange voice as his imaginary friend. That was his idea. And he was 5 years old and had never acted at the time, and Kubrick liked it and went along with it. So there are even like real hard-ass
Well,
directors.
probably in that case, he knew a 5-year-old would know how a 5-year-old thinks.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I-
But the thing
you
is,
know,
any good director is going to listen to the cast.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that and now the director always has the final say,
So-
of course. But
Yeah. Now you were talking about casting and acting, and you
Yeah.
had the opportunity actually to cast someone to play you as a child.
yes, I
was
did.
on the set of that, and how was that to have to think of yourself back as a child and cast someone to?
Well, it was very easy because there were two kid roles and
Oh,
only
okay.
two kids applied. So
One of them had to be you, and one of them had to be your brother.
Yeah, so the older one was me, the younger one was my brother, since I was the older one. But yeah, and the thing is, because it was my first film that I made by myself. It's called I Just Want to Take My Little Boys to Swenson's. It's on YouTube and Vimeo. I'm sure it'll be the first thing that comes up if you type in that
Oh,
title.
it's up finally.
Oh, it's been up for a long time.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I didn't realize you didn't know that. Okay.
No,
Yeah.
you didn't mention it.
Oh,
to me.
okay. I completely forgot. But yeah,
I've been sitting here waiting.
Yeah, it's been up since October, so
Okay.
yeah, go check it out. But it's
Yeah, I do appreciate the special thanks credit you gave
Eh,
me on that.
yeah, well,
That was.
yeah, you hung with us on set the whole night. So, but yeah, it's actually based on a real event from my childhood that stood with me for 40 years. I thought I might as well make a movie out of it, where my father wanted to take us to the Swenson's ice cream
Well,
parlor.
I was gonna say, don't give them the spoilers.
Yeah.
Have them watch it.
Okay, okay. But keep in mind, it really did happen pretty well as described in
You
the
know
film.
what? We ought to super deep movie analyze that one for fun.
Yeah, that would be
That would
fun,
be great.
yeah.
You know what? This conversation is so great. I think we ought to continue it another time.
Yeah, I think so too. Let's see, it's 1:04 now. We've been going 43 minutes. How much more time do you have left?
No, now.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, we only scratched the surface of this very deep topic, but I think it might actually work better this way because Michelle and I, we've gone over 2 hours in several of our episodes. So we went over a little over 3 hours with Rocky Balboa, or with the movie Rocky Balboa, which really was too long. Although I still had fun with it, but
Yeah, I think that would be good. We can.
yeah, well, we'll do this hopefully in the next
yeah.
few weeks because there's and we'll try to get into other topics next time. We went into this with no blueprint at all, which in most ways I like that better. Sometimes it makes things a little disorganized, but we covered a lot, and we still have a lot more to cover about independent filmmaking, so we will in the near future. And in the meantime, I do plan to be back with some other episodes, some solo, some with a guest, where we actually do regular episodes where we actually pick out a movie and super deep analyze it. I've got several on the horizon that I want to get to, and in fact we still haven't done Creed 2 yet, with the latest Rocky related film, which I'm really looking forward to that one a lot. That's for the most part a great movie, certainly a very worthy addition to the series, and although even then as we'll get into in the episode, my feelings about the movie changed a little bit when I saw the deleted scenes, which tie into how screwed up Hollywood is these days, and how so many people there don't know what they're doing. But Anyway, so thank you as always for joining us for this special supplement. We look forward to continuing this very deep discussion in the near future, especially because independent film is such an open-ended, um, vast ocean in which there's always something new to explore, and we hope to get those of you who are filmmakers. We hope to inspire you, and or maybe inspire some of you to get into working on independent films, cast or crew, and then finally hoping that more of you will watch some independent films and just get some enrichment that maybe you often don't get from the major studio Hollywood films. So anyway, this concludes this special supplement, and as always, thank you so much for joining me, and I cordially invite you to do so again in the near future as we continue to super deep movie analyze. So until then, for special guest host Michelle Gussow, this is Lec Zorn reminding you there is a difference only you can make.